Well, you guys made it to the last night of camp. Some of you guys barely, but here we are. If you guys don't know me, my name's Jeremy Miller. I run the Youth Venture Teen Centers. I know it was a bunch of us from Youth Venture in the house tonight. My wife, Marissa, and our 8-week-old daughter are not here. But if you want to see any pictures or videos, I have lots of them. But Marissa's not here, but Marissa's sister, Faith, where are you, Faith? Yeah, there she is. She's like a little miniature version of, not miniature, she's like taller than all of us, but a miniature version of Marissa. She's pretty awesome. You should be friends with her. Unless you're a boy, then I'll kill you. Sorry. I just have to embarrass her. It's my job. All right, well, tonight I don't have any weapons, any spears. I do have a hatchet in my bedroom, but I'm really excited about this message. I figured if I had a hatchet or any weapons in my hand, it might just go flying, and so that wouldn't be good. Tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground. Tonight, I'm going to talk about what I believe is the greatest challenge facing our generation. And the greatest challenge facing me right now is to not talk for an hour, so I'm going to put on a stopwatch. All right. I really believe that what I'm talking about tonight is the greatest challenge facing our generation. How we respond to this issue that we're going to talk about tonight will determine so much of your future and our future as a church. Tonight I'm going to take you on a journey. Like I said, we're going to cover a lot of ground, but I really believe that if you follow me tonight, what I'm saying as we go through this material, that it will change your life. And I want to start our journey tonight in the book of 2 Kings, and I want to read the story of Naaman in 2 Kings 5. How many of you guys have heard of Naaman before? Some of you guys. A lot of us, you've never heard of it. Well, in 2 Kings 5, we're introduced to Naaman. And we find out a little bit about him. It says, now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, and highly respected because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. And the man was also a valiant warrior. Well, right off the bat, we learn a few things. We learned that Naaman was a great and powerful man. He was a captain of the army, which means he was probably the second most powerful man in the entire nation of Aram. They're the Arameans. It says that he was a great man in the eyes of his king. He had the love and respect of his king, and also he was highly respected and loved by all the people. He was rich, he was powerful, he was loved and respected, he was influential, and he was successful. But Naaman had a problem. At the very end of that verse, it says he was a valiant warrior, and then it says, but he was a leper. How interesting, isn't it? See, Naaman had everything that anybody could ever want. He had all the money, all the riches, all the fame, all the love and respect, and yet he was dying. And none of his money, none of his titles, none of the respect or love of anyone could help him or cure the disease that he had in him. He was still going to die. Just like a poor peasant on the side of the road. He was no different than anybody else because he was a leper and he was going to die. See, in the Bible, leprosy is a symbol of sin. See, leprosy is progressive. It starts as a small spot and pretty soon, eventually spreads and affects every part of you. It dulls your senses. As it progresses more and more, you can't feel pain or sensation in your limbs and your toes and your fingers. And ultimately, it brings decay as limbs begin to rot and fall off, and it kills you. See, just like sin is progressive. It starts always at a small thing, but then eventually sin will spread and take over your entire life. Sin, as it progresses, will dull your sensitivity to the conviction of God and to be able to hear God's voice. And ultimately, sin decays you and brings death into your life. Also, just like leprosy, sin is no respecter of person. It infects every person. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a peasant. It doesn't matter if you're a really good person. No amount of money, no good works, no amount of popularity or possessions, image, or love can cure the disease that's in our heart. And eventually, it'll kill us. See, Naaman's leprosy to us is a symbol of the sin in our life. Let's look at the very next verse. I'll put on the screen, but I'll just summarize it. Naaman is a leper. He's going to die, but Naaman hears about a hope for his condition. He hears about a healing. His servant girl tells his wife, I wish that my master were in Israel, because in Israel there's a man of God, and his name is Elisha. So Naaman goes on a journey. He leaves his land, he leaves his people, and goes on this journey to meet with God and to be healed. See, it's just like the journey that God has taken so many of us on in this room. So many guys can relate to that. You know, whether it was through Youth Venture or a youth group or a camp or maybe just a friend, God led you on a journey, and it took you out of your home, out of where you were from, to find God and find his healing. Well, now let's look at verse 9, and the story begins to heat up. It begins to get interesting. So Naaman came, he left, the king sends him out, he leaves Aram, he comes to Israel with all of his horses and his chariots and his whole entourage of people. It says that he took 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and changes of clothes. It's funny they put that in there, clothes. Okay, cool. And he shows up at Elisha's door. See, we need to understand, this is sort of like if the general of all the British Navy showed up at Mark Dupont's house. You know, in Great Britain, they don't even call it a general. I don't know what they call it. But it's like this great man, this incredible leader, he's rich, he's powerful, he travels this great distance, and here he is. He shows up at the front door of Mark Dupont's house, knocks at the door. Here Naaman is at Elisha's front door, and what does Elisha do? And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you'll be clean. Elisha doesn't even greet him at the front door. He doesn't even respond to him. How crazy is that, right? If this general of the British Army shows up in Mark Dupont's house, he's like, I need to be healed. And Mark Dupont's like, hey, who is it? I go, it's this like general guy. Just go tell him to dip in the San Diego River, right? That's crazy. What's Elisha doing? And how does Naaman respond to this? Well, you can probably guess. In verse 11, it says, but Naaman was furious, and he went away and said, behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers in Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? And so he turned and went away in a rage. He got offended. It makes sense, doesn't it? He says, why can't I just dip in these waters? What is this? But how many of you guys know the healing wasn't in those rivers, was it? It was in the Jordan. And Naaman almost missed his healing. Why? Because he had wrong expectations. He showed up and he thought things were going to go a certain way. And in his pride, he thought that he knew what God should do. See, this is where so many people fail on their journey. We come to God with our questions, we come to God with our problems, and we expect God to do some certain thing that we think is best for him to do. But what happens when your expectations don't get met? When God doesn't do things the way you think they should be done? What happens when you finally realize that God isn't impressed by you? He's not impressed by how smart you are, by how popular you are. He's not impressed by your style. See, we want a spectacle. We want some great display. But what happens when God just tells you to do some simple thing? You know, maybe even sounds foolish to you. and it offends your carnal mind. That doesn't make sense, God. Why would God do that? I know better than God. Why do I have to wash in those rivers? Why do I have to do it that way? See, God could have done things Naaman's way, but this was a test. Would he be humble, and would he trust God? Would he do things God's way? Well, luckily for Naaman, he had some good friends. In verse 13, it says, then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? Right? If he had told you to climb a mountain or go on this great journey, you would have been like, yeah, that's cool, I'm going to do it. How much more when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. I just want to say one thing about this. If your friends aren't leading you closer to the Lord, if they aren't encouraging you to do things God's way, to trust God, then they are not your friends. See, usually when we talk about Naaman, this is what we focus on, right? How Naaman almost missed his healing, how his pride and his expectations got in the way. But one day as I was reading this story, I noticed something that I'd never seen before. And it's simply this, that there's not more to the story. See, basically, after this, Naaman's story just ends. And I thought to myself, there should be so much more to Naaman's story. Why isn't there more? Why don't we hear more about this man? See, he was perfectly placed to have such a huge impact on his nation. He was loved and respected by everyone, including the king. He was in a position of great influence, and he had just received a miraculous healing by God. And now he's going home with a great testimony. And yet there's nothing else. Why don't we hear more about him? In fact, in the very next chapter, that same country, Aram, is at war with Israel, attacking them. The question I ask myself is, what happened to Naaman's story? What happened to Naaman's testimony? Well, if you look at verse 18, we find the answer. A few other things happen in this story. He tries to pay Elisha with money. Elisha refuses. He tries to give him other stuff. His servant is greedy and does this shady thing. But then in verse 18, we find our answer. In the very last thing Naaman says to Elisha before he goes back home, and he says this. He says, in this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes, the king, goes into the house of Rimmon to worship the idol temples, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. Interesting, huh? Some of you guys are already getting it. See, Naaman had just been on this great journey, this journey that is symbolic of our journey with the Lord, the journey from being a leper where he was going to die, to finding the man of God, to facing the test of pride and expectations, to getting the healing. And now he's at this moment where a conflict arises. He's at this moment of decision where the serving the Lord comes into conflict with the expectations of his culture. And he has a choice to make, doesn't he? He has a choice to make. He's either going to choose faithfulness to God or faithfulness to his culture. We're all on this journey, and at some point in this point of his journey, he finally reached something where it was just too hard, where it just cost too much, where he would just disappoint someone that he wasn't willing to disappoint. And he failed the test, and he caved in. And he missed an opportunity to make a great impact and gain an even greater testimony. Why is it we don't hear more about Naaman? The answer is right there. See, this is the challenge that we all are going to face in our lives. We are all on a journey with the Lord. We're all at different points in that journey, but at some point, we're going to be faced with this challenge and this choice. This point when faithfulness to God is at odds with the expectations of our culture. And what are we going to do when that moment comes in our life? Are we going to blend in, or are we going to stand out? Are we going to be faithful to God or faithful to our culture? Naaman said, just the Lord pardon me. I'm going to follow God. I'm going to be a servant, but there's this one thing that I'm not willing to do. There's this one thing. See, I have to serve the king. When he goes into the temple, this idolatrous, demonic temple, he needs to lean on my arm, and I need to support him, and I just have to do it. What are we going to do? You see, the issue is this. How does God want his people to relate to their culture? What does God want us to do when we find ourselves in that place? The first thing we need to understand is that God doesn't just judge individuals, but he judges whole generations and whole cultures. See, we see ourselves primarily as individuals. We're each a unique snowflake. And we just need to express our unique snowflakeness in all of our different ways. But God doesn't look at us primarily like that. Primarily, he looks at cultures and whole generations. And not every culture is equal. You guys are like, that's not what they teach me in school. Well, they're stupid. See, in the New Testament, Jesus, he talked about his generation, the generation that he lived in. And he called them an unbelieving and perverted generation. Peter exhorted people to be saved from this faithless and perverse generation. In Psalm 78, it's a psalm about the generation that came out of captivity in Egypt. And this is actually the psalm that inspired this idea for this message. It's written to the next generation so that they might learn the lessons of the last generation and follow the Lord. And in Psalm 78, verse 8, it tells them the purpose, why they're learning this thing, so that they would not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. The question we have for us is, what kind of generation do we live in? You know, what would God say about our culture? The truth is, if we're honest, we'd have to say we know the answer, don't we? When you look around at America, when you look at a culture of our nation, the culture of our generation, we'd have to say that it's a faithless generation. It's a generation in a culture that's turned its back on God and mocked God's laws. Last night, Danny talked about this. And so, what does God say for us? What does God tell us? How does he tell us to relate to a culture like this when we find ourselves in this place? Well, let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. It says, do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Lawlessness is the spirit of our age. And what harmony has Christ with belly or believers with unbelievers? And verse 16, or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. What does God tell us to do? To be separate. You guys might say, oh, that's just one verse. I could give you verse after verse after verse, making this so abundantly clear all throughout the New Testament. Read Ephesians 4 and 5. Read Colossians 2 and 3. Read 1 John. Read 1 Peter. All throughout the New Testament, what God's saying is, do not partake. Do not participate. Be separate. In Romans 12:2, he says, do not be conformed to this world. See, God's plan was never for his people to blend in and be just like the world. His plan has always been that as his people, that we would be separate and unique and distinct. Let's look in 1 Peter 2:9. He tells us the kind of people, the kind of church that he wants us to be, the way he sees us. And he says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. In verse 11, he says that he wants us to relate to the world as aliens and strangers. He says that we're chosen, that he's chosen us and set us apart, that we're a royal priesthood, not common, but sacred and set apart, a holy nation. He says here that we're a people for God's own possession. In the King James Version, the words they use is a peculiar people. A people that's unique, a people that's different, a people that's set apart. Why? So that we might proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness and into his light. See, this is what God does. This is his plan, that he would take his people and put them in the midst of an ungodly culture, that they would be a unique and distinct people, so that we might reflect his character and his nature to the world around us. He wants us to be different. He wants us to be set apart so that we can show the world everything that God is like. And so what is God like? This is the part of the message that gets really exciting. God is holy. That word holy is used almost 700 times in the Bible. And hundreds of times all throughout, from the beginning to the end, it's used to describe who God is and what he's like. See, the holiness of God, it's one of the most important concepts in the entire Bible. And yet, it's a concept that we really don't understand. Partially, this is because it's just, the concept is too great for us. No matter how much we learned or how much we studied, we can never really understand the depths and grasp his holiness. But another reason is that we have a lot of wrong ideas of what holiness is. When we think of holiness, this is what we usually think of. No, not that phrase. There we go. What does he say? Heidely ho, neighbors? I think I messed it up, right? This is what we think of. When we think of holy, we think of someone who's really, really pure. Someone who would never do anything bad. They're so holy and so clean, they don't even step on ants, right? When they walk, the dirt doesn't even stick to the bottom of their feet. Or we think of someone who's very religious, someone who's at church all the time, and all their shirts are Christian t-shirts, and they carry around a giant Bible everywhere. And these things aren't bad. Absolutely, these things are wonderful things. But that is so far short of what holiness means, what holiness is, and what the holiness of God is. The word in the Hebrew that's used most often for holiness to describe God is the word kadosh. And no matter how many times I see it, all I can think of is Kung Fu Panda, skadoosh. It's the word kadosh. And what it means is apartness or sacredness or separateness. It means to be distinct, to be different. And maybe you guys will recognize this word, to be peculiar. It means to be uncommon. You see, listen, God is unlike anything else in the universe. 1 Samuel 2:2, he says, there is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. In 2 Samuel 7:22, for this reason you are great, O Lord, for there is none like you. And there is no God besides you. See, God's holiness is part of what makes him so awesome. I have a picture I'm going to put up. How many of you guys know what this picture is of? Really? Someone shouted out. Half Dome. How many of you guys have ever climbed Half Dome? I want to see a couple hands. Danny, is he the only one in this room besides myself? Oh, Mary Hoffman? For those of you guys that have climbed Half Dome, for those of you guys that have climbed those cables that take you all the way up the side to the back, for those of you guys that have stood kind of near the edge, or even just stood at the base and seen it, you understand the kind of awe that it inspires. The feeling in the pit of your stomach when you see just how amazing it is, how incredible it is. And why is it? What is it that's so awe-inspiring about it? Part of it is because it's so beautiful. Part of it is because it's so huge. But even more than that, what makes it so awe-inspiring to us, what causes our jaw to drop and that feeling to overwhelm us, is because it's uncommon and it's unique. There's nothing like it. See, if every hill was like Half Dome, if Cowles Mountain was Half Dome, if Mount Helix was Half Dome, then it would lose a little bit of its splendor, wouldn't it? See, when we say that God is holy, what we're saying is that there is no one like God. There is nothing like God. That he is completely different and completely unique than anyone and anything else in the universe. He's bigger, he's huger, he's more beautiful. God is holy in all of his attributes. God is holy in his strength. Everything that was created, the entire universe and all of existence, was created by the word of his mouth. He just spoke it into being. Existence itself is a product of his imagination. When you go outside and you look at that incredible mountainside, you think like, could you destroy that? The answer is no. Like hit it with a stick and do nothing. Yet one touch of God's fingers, and it says the mountains melt away and dissolve into nothing. And yet this is one hill, in one canyon, in one city, in one country on this entire planet. And that planet is one planet in the solar system. And that solar system is one of millions or billions of solar systems in the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way galaxy is one galaxy of billions of galaxies in the universe. And that entire universe fits in the palm of God's hand. It all came from his mind and his imagination. God is holy in his strength. God is awesome in his strength. There is none like it. It is completely different. It is incomparable to any strength or any power ever. How foolish it is that we would mock God, that we would treat him and his laws lightly. Did I give you this verse, Psalms 2? It says, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth, they take their stand. The rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed. Say, we don't need you, God. Who is God? He doesn't see. He can't do anything. And it says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. He scoffs at him. Us little petty pathetic humans. One speck on one speck of a planet in the midst of an entire universe. And yet we want to mock and treat God lightly. God is awesome in his power. He's holy in his power. God is holy in his love and his forgiveness. There is no greater love than his. There's never been a greater expression of love than what Jesus did when he died for us. No one has ever humbled himself more than Jesus did. No one has ever reached down as far as Jesus reached to pull us out of destruction. In Ephesians 2, it says, "But God, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together in Christ." His forgiveness is so great. The very people who are responsible for the suffering and death of his son, it says that he grants us life with him and an inheritance with Christ. He is holy in his love. He is holy in his forgiveness. He is awesome. They're beyond anything else or anything that we could imagine. He is holy in his mercy. We deserve such great punishment, and yet he shows us mercy. You think of the mercy that a man could give you. If you got in trouble up here at camp and you were going to get sent home, Danny could show you mercy and let you stay up at camp. If you were at my youth venture and you did something stupid and you were supposed to be kicked out of the center, I could show you mercy. You know, that's not that great, is it? A judge, if you had committed a great crime and you deserved to die, a judge could show you mercy by letting you live. But yet God's mercy is so much greater. We deserved eternal suffering and eternal punishment in hell, and yet God showed us mercy. He is holy in his mercy. He is awesome in his mercy. There is none like it. It's incomparable to anything else. He is holy in his grace. Grace is undeserved favor. Again, you think of the favor that a man can give. Danny could let you in early for dinner. I could let you ride in the front seat of my car. And yet God's favor, it opens up all the riches and power and help and supplies of heaven into our life. There is no door that God can't open. There's no door that he opens that any man could shut when the favor of God is on your life. He is holy in his grace and his favor. He's holy in his judgment. Whole cities have been destroyed by the wrath of God from heaven. The earth has opened up and swallowed people alive. There was a woman that turned into a pillar of salt. We should tremble at the idea of falling under God's judgment. And yet again, we treat him so lightly so often, don't we? The Bible says, "Do not fear man who can kill the body, but fear God who can send both body and soul into hell." He's holy in his judgment. There's nothing like it, and it should make us tremble. We could go on and on and on. We could talk all night about the holiness and the awesomeness of God. He's holy in his patience. He's holy in his wisdom and his knowledge. And yet we question God. We speak against God. We think we know better than God. He's holy in his justice. God is completely unique and different. There is no one like him. He is awesome and holy in all his ways and all his character, in every aspect of his nature. If that doesn't fill you with a sense of awe, let me just say this nicely. The problem is not on God's end. There is nothing boring about God. You could spend every moment for the rest of your lives trying to plumb the depths of his greatness, and you would never reach the end. In the Bible and in history, whenever people have seen an angel, they fall on their face like they're dead because of the glory and the awesomeness and the power of that being standing before them. and they pee their pants. I actually don't know about that. I'm just inferring it. And yet these same angels who are so full of glory, who are so full of power and awesomeness, when they're in God's presence, they cover their eyes. They won't look at him because of the surpassing greatness of his glory and his power. And it says that day and night they do not cease to say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord, the God, the Almighty, who was and is to come. Day and night for all eternity. They can never get enough. They can never be full. They can never become tired or used to God's glory, to God's holiness, his awesomeness, and his power. And here we go. Let's bring it all together. And yet God calls us to be holy. He says, be holy, for I am holy. He calls us to express his attributes, his nature in our lives and in our culture. He calls the body, his church, not to blend and be like the rest of the world, but to have a unique culture from the world around it. Not to follow the culture of the world, not to blend in with our generation, but to be holy. See, we need to understand this. What draws people to the church is not how much we're like them, it's how different we are. Philippians 2:15, it says, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. See, we're called to something so much greater than just to be good people or live a comfortable life. If you're saying to yourself, I don't need God, my life's pretty good, I'm a pretty good person, I'm pretty comfortable, I don't really need God, then you are missing out on something so much greater, something so awesome, to be holy, to reflect his holiness to the world around you. And that's the question that we're faced with. Who will you relate to? Who are you trying to be like? Are you going to blend in, or are you going to stand out? Are you going to be faithful to a sinful culture, or are you going to choose to reflect God's holiness and be faithful to him? I want to, as we wrap up tonight, I want to look really quickly at 4 ways to choose faithfulness to God. If you want to choose faithfulness to him, if you want to choose holiness, to be like him, these are 4 things that we need to do. We're going to go through these quickly. The first is this: you must reject worldliness. He makes it so clear. In 1 John 2:15, he says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in you. Because everything that's from the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of God's life is not from God. It's not holiness. It's not like him. It's not a part of him. But it's from the world, and the world is passing away and all of its lusts. Mark Hoffman said, and I love it, you can't be cool and holy. We don't like this. This is such a offensive thing to say, especially to young people. And I love what Mark says. He says, coolness is holiness to the world, but holiness is coolness to God. So much of the world's culture, the world's ways, the world's things are anti-God. They're common, they're dirty, they're lifeless. And if you're going to choose to love those things, to go after those things, then you are giving up holiness and the love of God. And how do we reject worldliness? We need to know his word. We need to study it, give ourselves to it. We need to constantly be comparing our lives and the world around us to what it says in here and choosing godliness. Number 2, you need to connect with the church. Let's look back at what it said in 1 Peter 2:9. Maybe you can guys catch on to this. He says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. You'll notice he didn't say, you are a unique snowflake. You are a chosen person, a royal priest or priestess, right? A holy person. No, he doesn't address individuals, but he addresses his body. See, together we are the people of God. Together we are supposed to show the culture of God. We are supposed to be a holy nation, a peculiar people. If you want to choose faithfulness to God and reflect his holiness, then you need to find your identity and your culture in the body of Christ, in the church. You need to stop looking for it in your music, in your fashion, in your friends that are ungodly, in the world's ways, in the world's things, and whatever it is. You need to find your identity in God, in him, in his culture. Number 3, remember his works. In Psalm 78, it says one of the reasons why they turned from God and were faithless is because they forgot. He tells the next generation, he says that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God. But the old generation forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them. One of the biggest reasons why people lose their sense of awe, why they get bored and fall away from God, is because they just simply forget. They forget God's works. They forget what he's done in their life. They forget their testimony. They forget how awesome he is. Mark Hoffman said, your life so much is going to be defined by what you choose to remember and what you let yourself forget. And the 4th thing is this: you must humble yourself. The awesomeness of his holiness and his power should breed such a humility in each one of us. His power, his judgment, his wisdom, and his mercy. Let's go ahead and have the band come on up here. Band people. Come on. We lost them. All right, I'll sing, no problem. Band people. Get in here, come on. Hey, band. They were just so deep in prayer, they couldn't break themselves out of it. All right. I want to end with this. Bring it all around. I told you I was going to take you on a journey tonight. And I've been praying tonight that God would give you guys a revelation of his holiness. As we worshiped God in the front here, his holiness was here. Some of you guys, you felt it, you encountered it, and you were in awe of it. You could see it in how you worshiped. The truth is, we are all Naaman. Every one of us in the room, we're Naaman. We're all at some point in that journey. For some of you guys, maybe you're still a leper. You're still dead in your sins. You haven't yet realized that nothing else can cure you or heal you. Not good works, not your friends, not your money, not any accomplishment or achievement. You've still yet to discover that healing is only found in him. Others of you guys are on some different part of that journey. But if you continue on, at some point you're going to face that question. Will you be faithful to God? Who are you going to be like? At Future Quest, I hope you guys remember, Mark talked about the difference between bystanders and those who stand by. And on the last night of Jesus' life, he looked at his disciples and he said, "You are those who have stood by me in my trials." If you'll stand by Jesus, if you'll choose faithfulness to God, to be like him, to reflect his holiness, you're going to gain a great testimony and you're going to make a huge impact on your world. Let me pray in this worship. Jesus, we love you. God, thank you. That it's not because of us, it's not because of our goodness, but because of who you are. Because of your mercy and your grace. Because of your holiness and your love. I just pray tonight that there would be a continued sense of awe and wonder, of holiness, and a sense of your holiness, Lord. We love you, Jesus.